Welcome back and welcome to your first photography lesson. I hope you're excited because I know I am. We're going to talk about basic elements of photography this time. The camera, the concept, and what the heck is a lens. So let's take a look. We know there are some things that we need to have in order to create a photograph. Photograph. Well, the word photograph comes from Greek origins and it simply means light writing. Photo, light, and graph, writing. So really, when we're making a photograph, we're writing with light, we're controlling that light for a purpose. And we need a couple of things to get that going. We need a way to create that image with light, and that's what the lens does. Okay. We need a light tight box where that image can actually be formed and seen, and that is what the camera does. So let's get looking at that camera. And again, the word camera, well, it actually means room. And during the Renaissance, lots of artists had a secret. And that secret was that they were using a camera obscura to make the beautifully detailed drawings that would become beautifully detailed paintings. The artist David Hockney has done wonderful research on this, and I've included some links to this in the course for you if you'd like to know more. Now, camera obscura literally means dark room. Camera, room, and obscura, dark. And it really was a dark room. Here we can see an illustration from back in the day, as they say, of a person inside the dark room, and they're holding a canvas and there's a pinhole in one of the walls. And light from the exterior is being cast on that canvas through the pinhole. And would you believe it? There's an upside down and backwards image of the world outside projected onto that canvas. Woohoo for this newfangled technology, right? Well, actually, the idea of the pinhole as a device that could be used to form an image is something that goes way back to Aristotle, who saw an eclipse of the sun through fig leaves as they overlapped on the ground below him. Today, of course, we generally don't walk around with a huge dark room in order to make pictures. We walk around with a little handheld camera obscura, but basically they're the same thing. They're a little dark room in which an image can be created by the action of light. So how does this work? Well, the pinhole is so tiny that only one or two or maybe three or four or just a few rays of light can pass through that pinhole. And because only a few rays of light can pass through the pinhole, what's arrayed on the inside of the box is a fully formed image. We don't need a lens. But with most cameras that we buy, we're not going to come with a pinhole. They're going to come with a lens, and there's a very good reason for that. The pinhole is a very small hole and very little light gets through. It would take an immensely long time to make an exposure even with a high ISO with that pinhole. What the lens does is it allows us to use a lot more rays of light, and they spread apart. There's lots of them, and so the lens brings them back together again at the focal point. And we see that in this illustration here. Light rays from Rosie the Riveter are being spread apart and they pass through the lens and they're brought together at the focal plane. And it's the bringing together of the light rays that we call focus. When an image is out of focus, well, what that means is the light rays have been reflected from a point on our subject and spread apart and have gone through the lens and have been brought together someplace other than on the focal plane. We see that here, that the light rays have come together a good distance before they've reached the focal plane. When they get there, they're creating a circle rather than a fine point of light, and that circle we call, funnily enough, a circle of confusion. You'll recognise that as being blurry or out of focus. So anything that's out of focus in your picture is out of focus simply because the light rays haven't been brought back together again at the focal plane on the sensor in the camera. And if you've done any research at all on cameras, you've probably noticed that cameras will come with either a fixed focal length, for example this 24mm, or they might come with a zoom lens, which can zoom from anything 15 to 30mm, 25 to 75, or in this one 100 to 300mm. You might be scratching your head and saying, what the heck's all that about? Well, a focal length is simply a measurement of distance from the optical centre of the lens to the focal plane where the image is focused on infinity. And infinity when we're photographing the moon or something very far away. We focus on that, we focus our lens on infinity, and that distance from the optical centre of that lens to the focal plane, that's what we call focal length. In this illustration, we're seeing a 50mm lens, so it's 50mm from the point of focus to the optical centre of the lens. A shorter lens is a smaller number, so say 28mm, it's less than 50. Okay, so it's a shorter lens, short lens, same principle. It's the distance from the focal plane to the optical centre of the lens. And when that lens is focused at infinity, that's how you know you've got it. You can see here that this 28mm lens is closer to the focal plane than the 50mm lens was. In photography, we have something called normal focal length, and that's the concept that we really need to be aware of. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking to you about what this is. And normal focal length means that the perspective of the scene is rendered normally. In other words, something that's 3 feet away looks like it's 3 feet away. It's similar to the way that your eyes work and perceive the scene, and knowing the normal focal length for your camera is pretty important. In this illustration, we see how Rosie appears with the wide angle or shorter focal length lens. The shorter the focal length of the lens, the smaller your subject is going to appear on the sensor at the focal plane, and the more far apart things are going to look like on your scene. We're going to cover this a lot in the future lessons, but right now it's important just to understand the principle. If we switch to a telephoto lens, in other words a longer lens, well, what happens? Well, check it out. Our subject Rosie is now cropped off. We don't even see part of her on the focal length on the sensor. And why is that? Well, the telephoto or longer photo length lens makes things appear closer to us, bigger than they would appear to our eye. Think of the car mirrors and how that works. Everything is gauged and based on how your eye might perceive space. Well, clearly there is a difference in sizes of lenses. I've got here my 24mm lens, and it's a fairly wide angle, and over here I've got my zoom lens. And you can see here this goes 100 to 300 mils. That's quite a longer lens than this one. And with the zoom lens, I can pick out any focal from 100 to 300 mils and everything in between. This is a fixed focal length lens at 24mm. It's not going to change. But what's the difference? What difference does this focal lens make? Well, think back. If we use the 24mm lens, will I see all of Rosie? What about if I switch to this zoom lens? What will happen then?